The Last Light in Pale Hollow, an Old West Sleep Story. Chapter 1. The Last Light in Pale Hollow. There is a town in the New Mexico territory that the maps have almost forgotten. If you were to ride out from Santa Fe past the cottonwoods that line the dry arroyos, past the mesas that turn copper and rose, when the sun sinks low, you would eventually come upon a valley cradled between two sleeping mountains. And in that valley, half swallowed by sagebrush and thyme, you would find Pale Hollow. Once this had been a town of noise and ambition. Silver had been pulled from the mountains behind it, and for a few bright years Pale Hollow had bustled the way only a mining town can bustle, with wagon wheels creaking under heavy loads, with hammers striking anvils, with laughter spilling out of saloon doors into streets that never quite went dark. There had been a schoolhouse with a bell that rang every morning at 8. There had been a mercantile with barrels of pickles by the door and bolts of calico stacked to the ceiling. There had been a hotel with a wraparound porch where travelers would sit in the evenings and watch the sun paint the mountains gold. But silver, like all things, runs its course. The veins thinned, the assay office closed, and one by one, in the quiet way that things end, not with a single dramatic departure, but with a slow, steady trickle, the people of Pale Hollow packed their wagons and left. They went to California. They went to Denver. They went wherever the next promise glimmered. Now the storefronts stand empty, their windows filmed with dust, their signs creaking on rusted hinges when the wind moves through. The boardwalks have begun to sag in places, and grass has found its way up between the floorboards of the old dance hall. The schoolhouse bell no longer rings at 8. It simply hangs there, silent, swaying, only when a strong gust reminds it that it still exists. And yet, if you were to stand at the edge of town on any given evening, just as the sun begins its slow retreat behind the western ridge, you would notice something. A single window glowing warm and gold against the deepening blue of dusk. A thread of chimney smoke rising straight and unhurried into the darkening sky. The smell of wood smoke and baking bread drifting faintly on the breeze. That light belongs to the Brennan house. It is the only home in Pale Hollow that still remembers what it feels like to be lived in. Samuel Brennan is a tall man built the way men are built when their whole lives have required their hands. Broad through the shoulders, weathered at the knuckles, with lines around his eyes that come from squinting into 40 years of prairie sun. His hair has gone the color of ash at the temples. His voice is low and unhurried, the kind of voice that seems to move at the same gentle pace as the wind moving through dry grass. He is a man who does not rush. Every evening, as the light softens and the shadows stretch long across the empty streets, Samuel rises from his chair by the window, takes down his coat from its peg, and steps out into the town that everyone else abandoned. He does the same things in the same order every single night. First, he walks to the old white church at the end of Main Street, the one with the bell tower and the crooked front steps, and he lights the lantern that hangs beside its door. He does not know anymore whether he lights it out of habit or out of hope. Perhaps it no longer matters which. Then he walks the length of the boardwalk, sweeping away the day's dust with a broom that has worn thin at the bristles, clearing a path in front of storefronts that no customer will ever enter again. He sweeps the steps of the mercantile. He sweeps the porch of the hotel. He does this slowly, the broom moving in long, even strokes, the sound of bristles on wood, the only sound in the whole wide valley besides the wind. After that, he walks to the public trough at the center of town and works the old iron pump until fresh water rises cold and clear, filling the trough for horses that no longer come. The pump handle creaks with each stroke, a familiar comforting sound like the town clearing its throat before speaking. And last, just as the first stars begin to prick through the deepening indigo of the sky, Samuel climbs the few worn steps to the little bell tower behind the old town hall, takes hold of the frayed rope and rings the bell. Once, just once. Not because anyone is coming, but because someone always used to. The sound rolls out across the empty valley, low, resonant, unhurried, and drifts over the abandoned rooftops, over the silver mine long since gone quiet, over the mountains standing patient in the distance. And then it fades, the way all sounds eventually fade, leaving behind only the soft hush of wind moving through empty streets. Samuel stands there a moment longer than he needs to, listening to the silence that follows. Then he turns and begins his walk home. Inside the Brennan house, Eleanor is setting the table. She moves with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has done this same task 10,000 times, laying out plates worn smooth from years of use. setting cups just so smoothing the edges of a tablecloth that has faded from red to the soft pink of an old sunset. Eleanor Brennan has a face that seems built for gentleness, soft around the eyes with a small knowing smile that rarely leaves her lips even in silence. Her hands, like Samuel's, show the years. Flour dusts her apron most evenings, and the smell of baking bread clings to her hair. Her sleeves the very walls of the kitchen. Tonight, as every night, she sets the table for six. There is a place for Samuel, a place for herself, a place for their daughter Mary, who is 9 years old and has her mother's soft eyes and her father's quiet patience. A place for their son Thomas, who is 12 and spends his afternoons chasing lizards through the ruins of the old livery stable. And two more places besides. One for the Whitfields, who used to live in the blue house on the corner before they left for Sacramento 11 years ago. One for old Mr. Holloway, who ran the mercantile until his heart gave out one quiet Tuesday morning and was buried on the little hill behind the church. No one in the Brennan family speaks about these extra places. No one asks why they are set or for how much longer they will continue to be set. It has simply become part of the shape of their evenings, the way the sunset is part of the shape of the sky. Perhaps it is simply Eleanor's way of remembering. Perhaps it is a kind of prayer spoken not in words, but in the careful placement of a fork beside an empty plate. Whatever it is, it has become as natural to the family as breathing and just as unremarked upon. When Samuel comes through the door stamping the day's dust from his boots, the warmth of the kitchen rushes out to greet him, firelight and bread, and the soft murmur of his children's voices from the next room. He hangs his coat, washes his hands in the basin by the door, and settles into his chair at the head of the table with the unhurried contentment of a man who has done exactly what needed doing. Bell rang clear tonight. He says the way he says most evenings, as though it were news worth sharing. It always does. Eleanor answers, and there is something tender in the way she says it. Not humoring him, but agreeing with him, the way two people agree on something they both quietly believe. The children come to the table. Mary sets down a small jar of wildflowers she gathered that afternoon from the meadow behind the old graveyard, placing it in the center of the table where its purples and yellows catch the firelight. Thomas washes the dust of the livery stable from his hands and slides into his chair, already reaching for a slice of bread before his mother can swat his fingers away with a laugh. They eat together in the golden hush of lamplight, the fire popping softly in the hearth, the wind sighing against the window panes. Outside, the town of Pale Hollow settles into darkness. Empty street after empty street, window after unlit window. But here in this one small house at the edge of everything, there is warmth. There is the smell of bread and wood smoke. There is the sound of a family talking quietly about small things. A hawk Thomas saw circling the mesa, a new bloom Mary found by the creek, the mending Eleanor has planned for the morning. And there at the far end of the table, two empty chairs wait patiently in the lamplight, as they have waited every evening for longer than anyone still remembers. No one asks why. It has simply become part of life in Pale Hollow. The way the mountains are part of the horizon, the way the stars are part of the night. Some things do not need explaining. They only need to be carried gently evening after evening, the way Eleanor carries the bread to the table, and the way Samuel carries the sound of the bell out into the waiting dark. When supper is finished and the dishes are cleared, the family gathers by the fire. Samuel reads aloud sometimes from one of the few books that survived the town's slow exodus. Other nights, Eleanor hums old hymns while she mends a torn hem, her needle catching the firelight with each small, patient stitch. The children curl beneath quilts on the floor, half listening, half dreaming, until their eyes grow heavy, and Eleanor carries them one by one up the narrow stairs to bed. And Samuel sits a while longer by the window, watching the last of the firelight flicker against the glass, and beyond it the dark shapes of the empty town stretching out toward the mountains. Silent, waiting, patient. Above it all, the stars spread out in their slow, endless procession, the same stars that once watched over a town full of noise and ambition, and now watch over a town that has learned quietly how to rest. This is how it begins every evening in Pale Hollow. And this is how it will begin again tomorrow. Chapter 2. Living Beside Memories. The seasons move slowly in the high desert, and the Brennan family has learned to move with them. When the last frost of winter finally loosens its grip on the valley, Samuel spends his mornings walking the perimeter of town, checking the old fences that once kept livestock from wandering into the mine tailings. Most of the animals are long gone now, sold off or set loose when their owners departed. But Samuel repairs the fences anyway, replacing a rotted post here, tightening a sagging wire there, working with the same unhurried care he might give a fence that still had something to protect. Storms coming end of the week. He tells Thomas one such morning, running a weathered hand along a fence rail to test its give. Wind'll come down off the mountains hard. Best the old Whitfield corral doesn't fall over on itself before it's had the chance to stand a little longer. Thomas, who has inherited his father's quiet way of accepting things without needing them, explains simply, nods and hands over the hammer. It is one of the small mysteries of Pale Hollow, and there are many, that a fence meant to hold nothing should be repaired with such devotion. But Samuel has never seen it as strange. To him, the town is not empty. It is only quiet. And quiet things he believes deserve care, same as loud ones. Perhaps more. The children have their own rituals woven so naturally into the fabric of their days that they have stopped feeling like rituals at all. Every Sunday afternoon, Mary walks the winding path up the small hill behind the church. A handful of wildflowers gathered fresh that morning, clutched gently in her fist. The little graveyard there holds perhaps 30 souls, some from Pale Hollow's earliest days when the mine was young and hungry, others from later years when age or illness took what silver never could. Mary does not know most of the names by heart, but she has learned to read the weathered stones, tracing the letters with a small finger, and she leaves a flower on each one she can find, regardless of how faded the carving has become. "Why do you do that, Mom?" A passing peddler once asked her, reining in his mule at the edge of town, curious at the sight of a child so devoted to strangers long dead. Mary considered the question with the seriousness only children seem to manage. "Because somebody should," she said, "and nobody else is here." The peddler had no answer for that. He simply nodded the way people often nod when a child says something too true to argue with and rode on. Eleanor's devotion takes the shape of bread. Every baking day, and in Pale Hollow nearly every day is a baking day. She makes far more than the family could ever eat. Loaves cool on the windowsill, their crusts golden and fragrant. And when evening comes, Eleanor wraps 2 or 3 in clean cloth and carries them out into the settling dusk, setting them gently on porches that have not felt a footstep in years. Just in case, she always says, though she has never once been asked to explain herself, and no one in the family has ever asked her to. She leaves a loaf on the porch of the old Whitfield house, its blue paint faded now to the color of a tired sky. She leaves one at the mercantile, propped just inside the door, where old Mr. Halloway used to greet customers with a tip of his hat. Sometimes, if the wind has been kind and the birds have not found them first, the loaves remain there for days. Small offerings to a town that cannot eat, cannot thank her, cannot do anything but stand quietly in the fading light and receive her kindness the only way it still can. Some might call it foolish, this feeding of empty houses, but there is a kind of logic to it that only makes sense from inside a life like the Brennans. To stop baking the extra loaves would be to admit finally and completely that no one is coming back. And Eleanor, gentle, steady Eleanor, is not yet ready to make that admission, even if some quiet part of her has already begun to suspect the truth. Letters arrive perhaps once a season, carried by whichever traveler happens to pass close enough to the territorial post road to collect Pale Hollow's meager correspondence and see it delivered. They come from cousins in Ohio, from an aunt in Missouri, from Eleanor's sister, who settled in San Francisco years ago, and writes in a hand grown increasingly impatient with each passing year. "Why do you stay?" they ask, in one form or another. "The mine is finished. The town is finished. Come west or come east, but come somewhere. There is nothing left for you there but dust and memory." Samuel always answers the same way in his slow, careful script, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight, while Eleanor mends beside him and the children sleep upstairs. Someone should remember this place while it still remembers itself. He writes and seals the letter and sends it back out into a world that does not seem to understand. It is not that Samuel cannot explain himself further. It is that he has never quite found the words to make others understand something that feels to him as plain and simple as the mountains standing on the horizon. Pale Hollow was a home to hundreds of people once. Children were born here. Marriages were made here. An entire town's worth of laughter and grief and ordinary daily living happened on these streets, and it seems to Samuel a terrible thing that all of it should simply be allowed to blow away like dust, unremembered, uncared for, as though none of it had mattered at all. So he stays. He lights the lantern. He rings the bell. And slowly, without quite meaning to, he has come to feel less like the last man in an abandoned town and more like the keeper of something far larger than himself, a caretaker not of buildings, but of memory itself. Travelers pass through more rarely as the years go on, but they do still come. Drovers moving cattle to distant markets, prospectors chasing rumors of silver in the next range over the occasional family bound for California with all their worldly belongings creaking along behind them in a wagon. They always stop when they see the light in the Brennan window. They always ask the same question in one form or another. Why do you stay in a dead town? Samuel has given many answers over the years, none of them quite satisfying, not even to himself. He has said it is because he cannot bear to leave the mountain that raised him. He has said it is because Eleanor's mother is buried on the hill behind the church, though that is only partly true. Eleanor's mother is buried in Missouri, but the sentiment he finds still rings honest in some way he cannot fully explain. He has said simply, somebody has to, and left it there because sometimes that is the truest answer of all. No answer ever seems large enough to hold the whole of it. But the travelers nod anyway, thank the family for a warm meal and a night's shelter in the old hotel, which Samuel keeps swept and aired for exactly this purpose, and continue on their way come morning, carrying with them a strange small story about a family who chose to keep a dead town company, and after they leave life in Pale Hollow returns to its slow, familiar rhythm. The empty houses over time begin to feel less like abandonment and more like sleep. Samuel walks past the old schoolhouse each evening and imagines without quite meaning to that it is only resting, that somewhere behind its dusty windows the shapes of children still bent over their slates, and that if he listened closely enough on a still enough night, he might hear the echo of the teacher's voice calling the class to order. He does not believe in ghosts. He has told Thomas as much more than once in the plain and steady voice he uses for things he wants his son to trust completely. But he has come to believe in something else, something harder to name. A kind of presence that lingers in well-loved places long after the people who love them have gone. Not a haunting, something gentler than that. A warmth left behind the way a hearth stays warm long after the fire has been banked for the night. The seasons turn. Spring gives way to a long golden summer when the wildflowers Mary gathers grow tall and thick along the creek bed, and the evenings stretch out lazy and warm, full of cricket song and the distant call of a nighthawk somewhere over the mesa. Then autumn arrives, painting the cottonwoods gold, and the family spends their days gathering wood-mending roofs, preparing the old town, and themselves, for the winter that always comes sooner or later to the high desert. And through it all, every evening without fail, Samuel walks his route. The lantern at the church, the swept boardwalk, the filled trough, the single ring of the bell rolling out over rooftops that have learned over the years to hold his family's quiet company as gently as they once held the noise of a thriving town. The empty houses feel less empty with each passing season. They begin instead to feel like sleeping friends, patient familiar waiting for nothing in particular, content simply to be remembered. Chapter 3. The Winter of Endless Silence. There are winters in the high New Mexico desert that arrive gently dusting the mountains with a thin coat of white that melts away by mid-morning. And then there are winters like the one that comes to Pale Hollow in Samuel's 43rd year. Winters that arrive like a held breath finally released, bearing the valley beneath snow so deep it reshapes the very geography of the town. It begins with a wind that smells different, sharper, colder, carrying with it the particular hush that precedes a heavy snow. Samuel feels it on his evening walk and quickens his pace, if only slightly, checking the church lantern's oil, testing the give of the old hotel's porch roof, making certain the woodpile beside the house stands tall and dry. The snow begins that night, and it does not stop for 3 days. When it finally clears, Pale Hollow has become a different world entirely. The empty streets, once merely dusty and forgotten, are now buried beneath drifts that reach past a man's knees in places higher still, where the wind has piled it against the sides of buildings. The schoolhouse roof groans faintly beneath its new white burden. The old dance hall's sagging porch disappears almost entirely beneath a smooth, unbroken sweep of snow, so that the building seems to be sinking slowly into the earth the way old things sometimes do. Samuel still makes his rounds each evening, though now it is slower, harder work. Wading through drifts to reach the church, breaking a path with a shovel to clear the boardwalk he insists on sweeping, despite the futility of it breaking the ice that forms nightly over the trough, so that water at least remains free and clear for horses that will not come. He does it anyway. He has always done it anyway. But something is different this winter, and it takes Samuel some weeks to fully understand what it is. No travelers come. Not one. The territorial post road that skirts the edge of the valley grows quiet beneath its own blanket of snow, and week after week passes without a single wagon, a single rider, a single distant figure on the horizon breaking the smooth white monotony of the landscape. No letters arrive. No drovers pass through seeking shelter for the night. No prospectors ask directions to the next range over. For the first time in all the years the Brennan family has kept their lonely vigil, Pale Hollow is entirely, completely alone. No birds sing in the frozen cottonwoods along the creek. Even the wind, usually so constant a companion, seems to hold itself still on the coldest mornings, as though the whole valley has drawn in a breath and simply forgotten for a while to let it out. Inside the house, the family draws close around the fire each evening, the way people do when the world outside grows too quiet to ignore. Eleanor's baking slows. Flour grows dear when no wagon can reach town to resupply the mercantile that no longer operates anyway. But she still manages a loaf every few days, still wraps it in cloth, still carries it out into the biting cold to leave on a porch buried beneath snow, though now she must dig a small clearing. First brushing away drifts with her mittened hands before setting the bread down gently, as though tucking a small creature in for the night. Thomas grows quieter during these weeks, spending long hours by the window, watching the snow fall in its slow hypnotic drift, his breath fogging small circles on the cold glass. Mary asks one evening whether the flowers she leaves at the graveyard will freeze beneath the snow, and Eleanor tells her gently that flowers know how to sleep through winter, the same as everything else, and that they will bloom again when they are ready. Even the ones on the graves, Mary asks. Especially those, Eleanor says, and pulls her daughter close against the cold. One evening, deep in the heart of that long, silent winter, Samuel makes his rounds a little differently than usual. The snow has stopped for a few days, leaving behind a sky scoured clean and impossibly clear, the stars burning cold and brilliant overhead, the mountains standing sharp and silver in the moonlight. Samuel walks his familiar route, the church, the boardwalk, the trough, the bell. But tonight, instead of turning straight home, he finds himself pausing outside the old hotel. He has passed this building 1,000 times. He knows every warp in its porch boards, every crack in its front windows, every place where the paint has peeled away to bare silvered wood. He keeps it swept and reasonably sound the way he keeps all of Pale Hollow out of that same quiet devotion that has shaped every year of his life here. But tonight, standing in the moonlit snow with his lantern casting long shadows across the porch, Samuel finds himself imagining. Not seeing, not truly, but imagining the way a tired mind sometimes does in the deep hush of a winter night. The sound of laughter drifting from behind those dark windows. The clink of glasses. The scrape of a fiddle being tuned. The particular warm murmur of many voices layered together, the sound a building makes when it is full of the people who love it. He stands very still and lets himself listen. There is nothing there, of course. Only wind and snow and the vast star-scattered silence of the valley. But Samuel does not feel foolish for having listened. He has come over the years to understand that memory is not so different from sound, that it too can echo faintly in the places that once held it, long after the original voices have gone silent. Not ghosts, he thinks, as he has always believed, only memories still finding their way home. He stands a while longer, breath clouding in the frozen air, and then turns and makes his way back through the snow toward the single warm light of his own window, glowing steady and gold against the deep blue dark. That night's supper is quieter than most. The fire burns low and steady in the hearth. Eleanor has managed, despite the dwindling flour, a small loaf of bread, and she sets it in the center of the table alongside a thin but hearty stew. The children eat without much talking, tired in the particular way that deep cold makes a person tired, even when the day has held no real labor. The two empty chairs sit at the far end of the table, as they always have. Samuel looks at them for a long moment, longer perhaps than he has allowed himself to in all the years since they were first set there. The firelight flickers across the empty plates, the untouched cups, the space where guests who left over a decade ago might once have sat. And for the first time, he says the thing that has been settling quietly inside him for longer than he has been willing to admit. Eleanor, he says, and his voice is gentle and hurried, the same voice he uses for everything in this life he has chosen. I don't believe anyone is coming back. Eleanor does not look up right away. She continues buttering a small piece of bread for Mary, her hands moving with their usual steady calm. But something in her shoulders softens, as though a weight she has carried for a very long time has finally been given permission to set itself down. No, she agrees quietly. I don't believe they are either. The children look between their parents uncertain, but neither Mary nor Thomas seems frightened by the words. There is nothing frightening in the way they are spoken. No grief in them, no despair. Only a kind of quiet honesty, the sort that comes not from giving something up, but from finally setting it down gently, the way one sets down a burden carried too long and too far. Perhaps, Samuel says slowly, choosing his words the way he chooses every board. He repairs every fence post he sets with care and patience. We are no longer waiting for anyone. The fire crackles softly. Outside, the wind moves at last through the frozen streets of Pale Hollow, sighing over rooftops and drifted snow over the silent church, in the sleeping hotel, in the small patient graveyard on the hill. No one at the table cries. There is no reason to. Instead, there is only a kind of settling. The same settling the whole valley seems to have undergone that long winter snow, smoothing over every hard edge, every jagged memory, until what remains is simply quiet, simply peace. Then why do we still set the table this way? Thomas asks, not unkindly, only curious the way boys his age are curious about the shape of things. Eleanor considers this, glancing at the two empty chairs with something like tenderness. Because remembering someone, she says at last, isn't the same as waiting for them. We can remember the Whitfields and Mr. Halloway and everyone else who ever called this place home without needing them to walk back through that door. The chairs don't need to be filled to matter. They only need to be there. Samuel reaches across the table and takes his wife's hand, and for a long moment the family simply sits together in the firelight, saying nothing more, needing nothing more. Outside, the last of that winter's clear night deepens toward midnight stars, wheeling slow and silent overhead, the whole valley wrapped in snow and stillness and a kind of peace that has taken years and one long silent winter to fully arrive. Chapter 4. Accepting the quiet. Spring returns to Pale Hollow the way it always does. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a held breath finally beginning to release. The snow retreats first from the south-facing slopes, then from the streets, then reluctantly from the shadowed places between buildings where the sun rarely reaches. The creek behind the graveyard swells with meltwater rushing loud and bright over stones that have sat silent and icebound for months. And then, almost overnight, it seems the wildflowers begin. They come up first along the old wagon tracks leading out of town. Small, hardy blooms pushing through soil that has not felt a wagon wheel in over a decade. Then they spread patch by patch, color by color, into the empty lots between buildings, along the base of the church steps, across the gentle slope of the little hillside graveyard, where Mary has spent so many quiet Sundays. Nature, Samuel observes one morning as he walks his rounds, does not wait for permission. It simply reclaims what it is given gently and without hurry, the way water finds its way downhill regardless of what stands in its path. He watches a tangle of morning glory work its way up the porch post of the old mercantile, its blue-purple blooms opening wide to the early sun. He notices grass thickening in the cracks of the boardwalk faster than he can manage to sweep it away. He sees one afternoon a pair of swallows building a nest in the eaves of the schoolhouse, weaving mud and dried grass into the corner where a bell rope once hung, and he does not have the heart to disturb them. Something in Samuel shifts that spring in a way he finds difficult to put into words even to himself. For years he realizes he has swept the boardwalks and repaired the fences and lit the lanterns with the quiet, unspoken hope that someday someone would return to find the town exactly as they left it, preserved, waiting, unchanged. He has been, without quite admitting it, a man guarding a door that no one was coming through. But watching the wildflowers claim the wagon ruts, watching the swallows build their nest in the schoolhouse eaves, Samuel begins to understand something gentler, something that settles into him not as loss, but as a kind of quiet relief. Pale Hollow is not waiting anymore, and neither, he realizes, is he. The family's rituals do not stop that spring. If anything, they deepen, taking on a new and different meaning, one built not around expectation but around gratitude. Samuel still walks his rounds each evening, but where once he swept the boardwalks to keep them ready for visitors who might arrive, now he sweeps them simply because the boardwalks deserve to be cared for, the way any old and faithful thing deserves care in its final years. He still lights the church lantern each evening, not because a congregation might gather, but because the little church in all its silence still deserves its light. He begins, too, a new kind of work. One Eleanor gently suggests to him one warm evening as they sit together on their own porch, watching the sun sink gold and slow behind the western ridge. "The nameplates on the old storefronts," she says. "The paint's worn clean away on half of them. No one will ever know the Mercantile was Halloway's or that the Blue House was ever the Whitfields if we don't tend to it." So Samuel begins in the long golden hours of spring and early summer to polish the old wooden signs that still hang above Pale Hollow's empty doorways. He mixes what little paint remains in the Mercantile's dusty back room and carefully retraces the faded lettering. Halloway's General Store. Whitfield and Sons, Pale Hollow. Hotel established 1861. His hand steady and patient, the same care he might give to writing a letter to someone he loved. Thomas helps him learning to mix paint and steady a ladder, and in the quiet hours of shared work, father and son talk about small things. The shape of clouds, the habits of the swallows nesting in the schoolhouse eaves, the particular blue of the sky just before evening settles in. Mary takes on her own new task that spring. Alongside her Sunday visits to leave flowers at the little graveyard, she begins to repair what the years have worn away, resetting stones that have tilted with frost, clearing weeds from around markers whose names have nearly vanished beneath decades of wind and rain. She works with a small trowel her father sharpened for her, kneeling in the soft spring grass, humming softly to herself the way her mother hums while mending by the fire. "Why do you fix the stones too?" Samuel asks her one Sunday evening, watching his daughter wash the dirt from her hands at the pump. Mary considers the question with her usual careful seriousness. "Because they held someone's name," she says, "and a name shouldn't just disappear because nobody's looking at it anymore." Samuel says nothing for a moment. He only nods, feeling something warm and quiet settle behind his ribs. The particular pride of a father watching his own convictions take root unbidden in a heart far younger and gentler than his own. Eleanor's contribution to this new season of caretaking is perhaps the gentlest of all. She begins to oil the hinges of every door in town, not to make the buildings ready for use, but simply so that the wind, when it moves through Pale Hollow's empty streets, will not have to work so hard to open them. She walks from building to building with a small tin of oil and a soft cloth, working each rusted hinge until it swings smooth and silent the way a well-loved door should. "It's a small thing," she admits to Samuel one evening, wiping oil from her fingers as the sun sets behind the ridge. "But I like to think the town rests easier for it. Fewer creaks in the night, fewer complaints from old wood that's tired of being ignored." Samuel, who has come to understand his wife's particular way of loving the world around her, only smiles and takes her oil-stained hand in his own. By midsummer, the family has begun a new project entirely, one that will not bear fruit for years, and that none of them, perhaps, will live to fully see completed. They plant apple trees. Samuel had found the seedlings the previous autumn, a small gift from a passing trader who'd had more cuttings than his own wagon could use, and he had kept them wintering in the old hotel's cellar, tended carefully against the frost. Now, with the ground soft and warm and the last thread of late snow well behind them, the family carries the young trees out to the edge of town near the old schoolhouse and begins to dig. "No one may ever harvest these," Eleanor observes, patting soil gently around the base of a young sapling, its thin branches trembling slightly in the afternoon breeze. "Maybe not," Samuel agrees, leaning on his shovel, watching his children water the newly planted rows with buckets carried up from the creek. "But someday birds will eat the apples. Deer will shelter in the shade. And maybe 100 years from now, some traveler will wonder who thought to plant an orchard in the middle of an empty town, and they'll know somebody cared enough to imagine a future here, even one they'd never see themselves." Eleanor considers this, watching her children's small forms move between the young trees, sunlight catching gold in their hair. "That's a kind of hope, isn't it?" she says softly. "Planting for a harvest you'll never taste." "I suppose it is," Samuel says, and for the first time in a long while the word hope does not feel to him like something aimed at a returning traveler, or a resurrected mind, or a town brought back to its former noise and glory. It feels instead like something quieter, something aimed simply at the future itself, whatever shape it takes, whoever, if anyone, happens to witness it. As summer deepens into its golden final weeks, Pale Hollow begins to feel, for the first time in over a decade, less like something waiting to be finished, and more like something whole exactly as it is. The polished nameplates catch the evening light above empty doorways, their lettering clear and proud once more. The graveyard on the hill sits neat and tended, its stones standing a little straighter, its grass kept short and soft beneath Mary's careful hand. The town's hinges swing silent in the wind, and somewhere at the edge of things, a small orchard of young apple trees stretches its thin branches toward a sky it will not fully know for years yet to come. Samuel still makes his rounds each evening. The lantern, the boardwalk, the trough, the single ring of the bell rolling out over rooftops that have learned over the years to hold his family's quiet devotion the way they once held the noise of a thriving town. But something in the ritual has changed gently and completely without any single dramatic moment marking the shift. He no longer walks his rounds waiting for the town to be found again. He walks them because the town exactly as it is, quiet, remembered, cared for, has become at last complete. Chapter 5, When the Last Window Sleeps. The years move on in Pale Hollow, the way seasons always have, gently without hurry, each one folding softly into the next. Thomas grows tall and broad through the shoulders, taking on more and more of his father's rounds, until eventually it is his voice that calls the evening single bell ring out, over the rooftops, his hands that sweep the boardwalks clear of dust. Mary grows into a young woman with her mother's soft eyes and her father's quiet patience, tending the graveyard on the hill, with a devotion that has only deepened with the passing years, until the names on every stone are as familiar to her as her own. Samuel's hair goes fully silver. Eleanor's hands grow slower at their kneading, though her bread remains just as fragrant, just as generous, carried out each evening to porches that have by now held her offerings for so many years that the wood itself seems to have grown accustomed to the weight of her kindness. The apple trees, once thin and trembling, grow tall and strong at the edge of town, their branches heavy each autumn, with fruit that falls more often than not uneaten to the grass below. Though deer come now in the quiet hours before dawn to graze beneath their shade, and birds nest each spring in their sturdy limbs, exactly as Samuel once imagined they might. The family's evening ritual never changes, not in its essential shape. The lantern is lit, the boardwalk is swept, the trough is filled, the bell is rung, once rolling out over a town that has long since stopped waiting for anyone and has instead learned simply to be loved. And every evening, without fail, Eleanor still sets 2 extra places at the table. Not out of waiting, not any longer. Only out of love, the kind that does not require a person's return in order to remain faithful, the kind that simply continues gently and without complaint, because that is what love in its truest and gentlest form has always known how to do. One final autumn arrives in Pale Hollow. Golden and unhurried, the cottonwoods along the creek turning the particular deep amber they turn each year just before the first frost. The Brennan family gathers that evening for supper the way they have gathered 10,000 evenings before. Samuel at the head of the table, his hair fully silver now, his hands still strong despite the years. Eleanor beside him, her apron dusted with flour, her smile as soft and knowing as it has always been. Thomas and Mary, grown now, though, on this particular evening, they have both found their way home drawn by nothing more than the simple pull of family and firelight in the smell of fresh bread. The stove burns warm in the corner, filling the kitchen with the particular golden heat that only deepens as the evening cools outside. The wildflowers Mary gathered that afternoon sit in their familiar jar at the center of the table, their colors soft in the lamplight. And at the far end of the table, as always, 2 chairs sit empty and waiting. Not for anyone in particular, but simply because that is where they have always sat and where they will perhaps always sit long after every person now gathered at this table has gone the way of all things. They eat slowly that evening, savoring a stew Eleanor has spent all afternoon preparing, tearing pieces from a loaf of bread, still warm enough to steam faintly in the cool autumn air. They talk of small things, Thomas's plans to widen the orchard come spring, Mary's quiet observation that the swallows have already left the schoolhouse eaves for warmer country, Eleanor's memory of the very first loaf of bread she ever baked in this kitchen decades ago, now back when the mine was still young and the streets outside still rang with noise. Samuel says little content, mostly to watch his family in the firelight. His wife's hands still graceful despite the years. His son's broad shoulders so like his own. His daughter's gentle patience carried now into her own quiet devotions. He feels watching them a piece so complete it settles into his very bones, warm and unhurried, as the fire crackling low in the hearth. When supper is finished, the family lingers a while longer by the fire as they always do. Eleanor hums softly while she mends a small tear in Thomas's coat. Mary reads aloud from an old well-worn book, her voice falling into the same slow, gentle rhythm her father has always used for his own quiet storytelling. Samuel sits by the window, watching the last light fade from the mountains outside the peaks, turning first gold, then rose, then a deep and silent blue. And then as the evening settles fully into night, the family says their quiet goodnights, and one by one, they make their way up the narrow stairs to bed. Samuel is the last to rise from his chair. He sits a moment longer in the stillness of the kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of his family settling in above him. Footsteps, soft laughter, the gentle creak of old floorboards bearing familiar weight. The fire has burned low in the hearth, its embers glowing a deep, steady orange, casting long shadows across the room. He rises finally and walks to the front window where a small oil lamp has burned steadily through every evening of his life in this house. Through the town's slow emptying, through years of quiet ritual, through one long and silent winter, through springs of wildflowers and summers of young apple trees, and autumns golden and unhurried, exactly like this one. He looks out through the glass at the town beyond, pale hollow, sleeping now beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars, its empty streets gentle and familiar. In the deepening dark, its buildings standing patient and cared for. Their nameplates polished, their hinges, oiled their memory, tended as carefully as any living thing. The wind moves softly through the valley, sighing over rooftops, drifting past the little graveyard on the hill where Mary's flowers still bloom each spring, rustling gently through the branches of an orchard planted by hands that never expected to taste its fruit, and that has, in its own quiet way, borne exactly the kind of harvest it was always meant to bear. Samuel reaches out and turns the small brass key on the base of the lamp, lowering the flame just slightly, though he does not extinguish it. Not yet. He stands there a while longer, an old man in a doorway looking out over a town he chose to love, long after the world decided it was no longer worth loving. He thinks of Eleanor's bread left on porches for over 20 years. He thinks of Thomas's steady hand on the bell rope and Mary's careful trowel resetting stones no one else remembers. He thinks of two empty chairs at a supper table set with love instead of waiting evening after evening for the whole of his life. He does not feel sad standing there. He has not felt sad about Pale Hollow in a very long time. He feels instead something quieter and deeper than sadness, a kind of peace that only comes to those who have spent a lifetime tending gently to something the rest of the world walked away from and found in that tending more meaning than the world could ever have offered them elsewhere. Good night, he says softly to the empty streets, to the sleeping mountains, to the whole wide silent valley spread out beneath its blanket of stars. Then he turns from the window, climbs the narrow stairs, and goes to bed beside his wife, who stirs only slightly and settles back into sleep with a small, contented sigh. The oil lamp in the front window burns on a while longer alone now in the quiet house. Its flame flickers gently, casting a soft golden glow across the empty kitchen, across the table with its two waiting chairs, across the jar of wildflowers, slowly releasing the last of their evening fragrance into the still air. Outside, the wind moves through Pale Hollow, the way it has moved every night for decades, drifting past the church, where the lantern Samuel lit that evening still glows faintly at the door. Past the mercantile, its nameplate catching the last silver light of the rising moon. Past the hotel, its porch swept clean, its windows dark and peaceful. Past the little graveyard on the hill, where 30 souls rest beneath stones tended with more love than most towns manage for the living. The stars spread out above it all, countless and unhurried, exactly as they have spread out above this valley since long before any silver was found in its mountains, and exactly as they will continue to spread out long after the last board of the last building has finally gently returned to the earth. The lamp in the window flickers once, twice. Its oil, after so many years of faithful burning, has finally begun to run low. The flame does not gutter or struggle. It simply grows smaller, softer, gentler, the way all things in Pale Hollow have learned over the years to grow gentle rather than grow gone. The golden light it casts across the kitchen dims by degrees, shrinking slowly from the corners of the room, retreating inch by patient inch toward the small brass heart of the lamp itself. And then, without any drama at all, without struggle, without sorrow, without anything but the simple, quiet completion of a task faithfully done, the flame fades entirely. The last light of Pale Hollow disappears into the dark. But it does not disappear the way a candle disappears when it is snuffed out in anger, or the way a fire dies when it is abandoned. It disappears the way a person disappears into sleep after a long, full day, gently, willingly, with nothing left undone and nothing left unsaid. The town settles into perfect silence, not abandoned, not forgotten, simply resting at last the way anything deserves to rest once its work is finally fully complete. The wind continues to drift through the empty streets, moving past darkened windows and silent porches, past a bell tower that will ring again. Come morning, past an orchard that will bear fruit again. Come autumn, past a graveyard that will bloom again. Come spring. It moves like an old friend making one final round before settling in for the night itself, whispering goodnight to every board and stone and silvered rooftop it passes. And high above it all, beneath a sky filled with more stars than any person could ever hope to count, Pale Hollow sleeps, peacefully, completely held gently in the memory of the one family who loved it enough to stay. Somewhere above in a small house at the edge of town, Samuel Brennan sleeps too, beside his wife beneath a roof that has sheltered 3 generations of quiet devotion. And somewhere beyond dreaming in that soft, unhurried place, where a person's thoughts grow as slow and gentle as a mountain wind he perhaps knows, in the way a person simply knows certain things without needing to be told, that the lamp has gone dark and that the town is finally fully at rest. It does not trouble him. It never could. For Samuel has spent a lifetime learning the same quiet truth that Pale Hollow itself seems to have finally learned, that being remembered gently is its own kind of light, one that does not need a flame to keep burning, one that continues long after the oil has run its course. And so the town sleeps, and so the family sleeps. And so somewhere far above the mountains and the empty streets and the small patient graveyard on the hill, the stars continue their slow and endless watch, the same watch they have kept since the very first light was ever lit in Pale Hollow, and the same watch they will keep long after the last one has finally peacefully gone out. Good night, Pale Hollow. Sleep well.